The Undercover owner stepped onto the aircraft wearing old sneakers, jeans, and a zip-up sweatshirt with a faded logo near the collar. His baseball cap was tugged low over his brow, obscuring the watchful, discerning gaze that had served him well in the boardroom for over a decade. It was a look so commonplace that no one on board would have suspected his true identity. He took a moment to appreciate the familiar hum of the engines and the subtle whiff of cleaning solution that always lingered near the front of the cabin. This was his airline, after all. He had spent years negotiating deals to build it from a regional brand into a powerhouse, yet only a handful of people outside his inner circle even knew his face. He'd always been a private man, the kind who preferred to operate behind the scenes, letting others accept the spotlight while he guided everything from the shadows. He'd grown used to blending in, which had become a game of sorts, dress in the most understated way, appear casually disinterested, and see how employees and travelers behaved without knowing the real nature of his presence. This trip was meant to be a routine quality assessment flight. His executive team loved talking about numbers, but he believed the best perspective came from actually being there, living the passenger experience himself. So he was prepared to watch the flight attendants discreetly, see how they interacted with those who paid for first-class comfort as well as the folks in economy. He wanted to see if the service had slipped, if the seat cushions had grown too stiff, or if the in-flight menu was lacking. Data in a spreadsheet never told the full story. He found his seat in economy, near the middle of the plane, in a row that extended 3 seats across. The seat was by the aisle. He'd specifically selected it to feel out how the flight attendants handled requests for drinks, or how quickly they responded to calls. He had an unassuming carry-on bag that he hoisted into the overhead compartment, then sank into his seat with a sigh. He ran his hand over the worn armrest, ignoring a small scratch near the plastic edge, and made a mental note to bring that detail up at the next maintenance briefing. Those were the small things that often went unnoticed but meant a great deal for branding. He was just settling in when 2 passengers slid into the seats directly behind him. He could hear the shuffle of their belongings and the distinct clink of a water bottle hitting plastic. People came and went through the aisle, jostling for space as they found their seats. A flight attendant at the front greeted everyone, her voice warm and inviting, offering a practiced, well-rehearsed line of welcome as each passenger boarded. When he heard the pair behind him begin to talk, he prepared to tune them out. Passengers engaged in countless mundane conversations before takeoff, and it all became white noise. Today, however, he found himself strangely attentive. Maybe it was intuition. One of the voices belonged to a young man, maybe in his 20s, while the other was deeper, older, and carried the confident tone of someone who always needed the last word. "Don't worry," the older voice said. "They never check who you really are in these seats. They only make a fuss if you're up front. Back here, it's just you, me, and an ocean of nobodies." He frowned to himself. The words felt coarse. He'd always prided himself on wanting to treat each passenger with dignity, no matter where they were seated. He remained still, forcing himself not to turn around, suspecting that they might see him looking. Instead, he closed his eyes, pretending to doze while paying attention to every syllable. The younger voice muttered something he couldn't quite make out. Then the older voice answered, "Let's just say we got business. Big business. I can't wait to get out of here. This flight's too long for my taste, but what can you do when the boss says jump?" His interest was piqued, as was his apprehension. It was possible they were up to something unsavory, or maybe they were just boasting. Hard to say, but it made him uneasy. He settled deeper into his seat, aware that eavesdropping was typically rude but also knowing he had a responsibility. This was his airline, and if passengers on board were planning anything disruptive or dangerous, he should know. Once everyone was seated, the engines began to roar. The recorded safety demonstration crackled over the speakers. Flight attendants started their well-orchestrated instructions on how to fasten a seatbelt, where the exits were located, and how to use oxygen masks. He recognized the script by heart, having heard it 100 times before. Yet something about the tension behind him made each word in that demonstration loom with more significance. He noticed how one passenger in the row across was repeatedly raising his hand to attract a flight attendant's attention, probably wanting to stow a bag or ask a question. The man behind him said something again, presumably to the younger seatmate, but the noise of the aircraft drowned it out. The plane taxied onto the runway, and his ears popped as the plane picked up speed, pressing him back against the seat. They were airborne in seconds, the comforting tilt of the wing carrying them skyward. Once the seatbelt sign flicked off, he decided to stretch his legs. Maybe he could get a sense of those two behind him. He unbuckled, stood, and turned. The older man had a shaved head and a worn leather jacket that looked older than the day. The younger man had bleached hair and a face stuck halfway between anxious and excited. Neither looked up. The older one had a suspiciously thick folder in his lap, which he was flipping through, while the younger man was tapping anxiously on the tray table. He passed them and headed to the bathroom, adjusting his cap to ensure that half his face remained hidden. He had no desire to blow his cover. Closing the door behind him, he listened to the low hum of the aircraft as he washed his hands. He stared at his reflection in the tiny mirror. He was used to seeing that face on the covers of business magazines, typically accompanied by headlines about his savvy investments or philanthropic work. Now, nobody recognized him. Perhaps the cap and sweatshirt were working. He stepped back into the aisle and made his way slowly past the seats. The older man lifted his head for the briefest moment, meeting his eyes. There was a flicker of interest, maybe curiosity about who was walking by, but then it vanished, and he resumed rifling through those mysterious papers. Back in his seat, he tried to focus on the safety and comfort aspects of the flight, reminding himself of his purpose here. The flight attendants wheeled the drink cart down the aisle. He ordered a ginger ale, politely declining the bag of peanuts. The attendant seemed friendly enough, though perhaps a bit rushed. He would add that observation to his mental checklist. Behind him, the conversation resumed. The older man's voice was subdued, as if he was purposely trying not to be overheard. "I'm telling you, once we land, we go straight to the building. Don't talk to anybody. We do this quick, and we get out. That's what you want, right?" The younger man sighed. "Right. But are we sure it's all set? I don't want to walk into something that ends up, you know." The older man grunted. "Relax. I'm not a rookie. This is nothing new for me. You, on the other hand, need to calm that nervous energy. People see that, they start asking questions." The owner leaned forward in his seat, tension coiling in his stomach. This wasn't typical casual conversation. It sounded like a plan, maybe even something illegal. Should he alert a flight attendant? Should he keep listening? 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, but he kept his outward composure. Jumping to conclusions could cause unwarranted panic, but it also might be foolish to dismiss it. He decided to do what he'd done for years in business negotiations: gather more intel, remain patient, and avoid reckless moves until he had enough facts. He caught the eye of a flight attendant passing by, but she was busy offering coffee to another passenger. He watched her fluid motion, the way she politely balanced multiple requests at once. When the attendants were done, the overhead lights dimmed slightly as the flight progressed. Passengers either settled into reading, napping, or watching in-flight entertainment. He closed his eyes briefly, thinking about how his father had once told him. The only way to truly understand people is to watch them when they think no one is looking. That was the entire reason he boarded incognito. Behind him, the conversation took a turn that gripped his attention. The younger man asked softly, "Why'd we pick this airline anyway? Could have been cheaper to take that other one." The older man chuckled. "We need to make a statement. And you know the rumor, right? This airline's got that big philanthropic owner, some do-gooder who invests in community projects. Well, let's just say certain people want to send a message to him." The owner felt his heart jolt. They were talking about him, or at least the persona he'd built for the public. But what message exactly did they want to send? He steadied his breathing, forcing himself not to whip around. Instead, he pretended to rummage in the seat back pocket, extracting the safety card and flipping it aimlessly. The older man continued. If we want them to pay attention, we have to do something that hits close to home. That's what this whole job is about, making people see we're not playing around. The younger man's reply was a hushed question. So you're sure it's not dangerous, right? We're not talking about bombs or anything insane, right? A low, humorless laugh. Kid, you've got a lot to learn. We're not terrorists. We just do what's necessary to prove a point. Now stop pestering me with these questions. It's all arranged. A wave of relief mingled with continued anxiety spread through the owner. They said they weren't terrorists, but they still had some nefarious plan in mind. Could it be some form of sabotage or a threat to his corporate office? Possibly. There was no way to be certain yet. He turned his gaze to the flight attendants bustling about. One of them was nearing with a tray of food for the midday meal. He smiled and reached for the small container of chicken and rice, along with a roll. She thanked him and continued on. He nearly forgot to say thanks, lost in his swirl of thoughts, but he quickly managed a polite nod. He took a few bites, his appetite nearly gone with worry. He wondered if this was a personal vendetta or something bigger, like corporate espionage. Over the years, he had stepped on more than a few toes while expanding his business. Perhaps an old enemy was orchestrating a message for him. Or maybe these men were just using the flight as a cover for something unrelated. Either way, he needed to stay alert. As an example of how easy it was to get away with shady deals, he forced himself to keep chewing to appear normal. A voice on the speaker announced that there might be turbulence ahead. Passengers were advised to remain seated and secure their seat belts. Almost in tandem, the plane gave a slight shudder, and he felt that familiar dip in his stomach as the aircraft navigated through the rough air. For a few moments, the only sounds were hushed murmurs of concern from some passengers, the roar of the engines, and the sporadic rattle of overhead compartments. He heard the older man behind him curse quietly when the turbulence jostled his folder, causing papers to spill onto the floor. There was scrambling, the rustle of pages. The younger man whispered, "Hurry, pick them up before someone sees." He thought quickly. If they were that concerned about someone seeing the contents of those papers, it might be something incriminating. It might also be something like a business proposal or sensitive data, but the hush in the younger man's tone suggested something illicit. The flight smoothed out, and the fastened seatbelt sign remained lit. After a minute or two, calm returned to the cabin. A flight attendant circulated with the trash bag, collecting empty meal trays. The tension behind him remained, but the men had grown quieter, presumably because of the close call with those scattered papers. He could hear faint whispering, but not enough to piece together their exact words. A phrase drifted to his ears. "We'll let them know we're here." Then another snippet. "No one expects it from someone like us." The man realized he needed to stay sharp. Maybe once they landed, he could discreetly alert security or local authorities to follow these two. He wanted to keep investigating, but the last thing he wanted to do was compromise the safety of everyone on board. Time passed, measured by the subtle drone of the engines and the occasional beep of the seatbelt sign turning off and on as they hit more patches of unstable air. A flight attendant announced that passengers were free to move about the cabin once again, prompting a small queue for the bathrooms. He decided to carefully glance over his shoulder, pretending to adjust his seat. The older man was leaning toward the younger, speaking so quietly the owner could only catch scraps. "Need you calm for the next part. Don't slip up once we land." "Not going to repeat myself." The younger man nodded, eyes darting around, clearly on edge. Eventually, the plane's lights were dimmed for the scheduled rest period on this flight. Given its length, several passengers settled in with blankets and tiny pillows. The owner found himself lost in thought, remembering how he'd always tried to maintain impeccable security on his flights. He made sure there were thorough background checks for staff and that each flight had safety measures in place. But you can't fully control who buys a ticket. He glanced at the silver band on his left ring finger. It reminded him of what his wife had said just that morning before he left. "Be careful. Sometimes you need to trust your instincts." He'd kissed her goodbye without a hint of fear for anything that could happen in flight. Now, he felt an ominous swirl in his gut as though danger lurked in the back row. He tried to rest, but every time he closed his eyes, fragments of that conversation replayed in his mind. The idea that they'd purposely chosen his airline to send a message wouldn't leave him alone. He wondered if they might be planning to confront him in person, or maybe just wanted to sabotage the airline's reputation. Later, he woke from a light doze to the sound of a heated argument. A few rows up, a man was complaining about being given the wrong type of meal. A flight attendant apologized, offering him a voucher for a future flight. The argument escalated momentarily, but the attendant kept calm. Meanwhile, behind him, the suspicious men didn't react at all, which somewhat surprised him. If they were troublemakers, might they not also join in some conflict to draw attention? They remained silent, perhaps not wanting any undue scrutiny. He wondered if it might be wise to quietly signal the flight attendant, or even the pilot, but he had no concrete evidence beyond overheard pieces of conversation. The last thing he wanted was to cause mass panic. On the other hand, ignoring a potential threat went against all his instincts. He decided to bide his time. Maybe he could speak with one of the flight attendants he trusted, someone he knew had been with the company for years, maybe even someone who had met him at an executive function. But that approach was risky. People talk. The men behind him might catch on. The flight progressed, and eventually, the final meal service began. He listened carefully to see if the men behind him gave any indication of what they planned to do upon landing. The older voice said, "You got everything you need for customs? Don't do anything that'll get us flagged." The younger voice responded, "Relax. I'm not that dumb. No weapons, no contraband. They won't find anything on me. And you know how thorough I was." It dawned on him that these two might not be messing around with simple mischief. They had deliberately chosen to avoid suspicion. That suggested a different kind of plan, something potentially large-scale, though not necessarily violent. He fiddled with the tray table latch, noticing the short nails of his right hand, a habit had fallen into whenever he was nervous. Finally, the pilot's voice rang through the speakers, announcing their descent. Seatbacks and tray tables were brought to their upright positions. Outside the window, a patchwork of city lights glimmered against the early evening sky, a hazy mix of oranges and yellows signaling they were close to home. He felt the plane dip down, the landing gear thudding into place. The overhead bins rattled as the plane hit a pocket of air. Passengers braced themselves for touchdown. The men behind him grew silent. He could practically feel the tension in their seats. The moment the plane touched the runway and slowed, the cabin was filled with the usual hustle, seat belts unbuckling prematurely, cell phones powering on, people stretching cramped legs. He remained still, letting the wave of anxious travelers press forward. He planned to keep an eye on them as they deplaned. If he followed them discreetly, he might see where they went. He could call an airport official if something seemed amiss. The older man hissed, "Keep your hood up. Don't let them see your face too clearly. We'll do this quick." The younger man agreed. He swallowed hard. His flight had landed in one piece, but the threat wasn't over. He retrieved his carry-on, stepping into the aisle behind them. The older man had that folder tucked under one arm. The younger man clutched a small backpack. They walked briskly past the flight attendants, who offered standard farewells. The men didn't respond beyond a curt nod. As soon as he stepped onto the jet bridge, he felt the cooler air of the airport terminal. He hung back, letting a couple with a baby and a large stroller go ahead of him. The two suspicious passengers moved swiftly, weaving through the crowd. He followed, maintaining a short distance. He debated calling airport security from his phone but decided to watch just a bit more to confirm his suspicions. He didn't want to make a formal claim without any proof of wrongdoing. He hovered near a newsstand, feigning interest in a magazine while discreetly observing the men. They headed toward the baggage claim area. He followed suit, blending in with the throng. The older man kept glancing at his phone, as if waiting for a message. The younger man looked more nervous by the second, scanning each face that passed. At baggage claim, the carousel started rotating. Travelers crowded around, each hoping to grab their suitcase first. The men stood on the far side, away from the main cluster of passengers. No one else seemed to notice them. He positioned himself behind a man reading text messages on his phone, trying to remain inconspicuous. After a few minutes, a black duffel bag appeared on the carousel. The younger man moved forward, snatching it up with an air of familiarity. He hauled it onto the ground, then joined the older man again. The older man's lips were pressed into a thin line. He seemed satisfied. They started for the exits, and the owner followed at a careful distance, attempting to look like just another weary traveler heading to ground transportation. Outside, the lights of private cars and taxis glowed through the glass. The men walked briskly, heading toward the rideshare pickup zone. He struggled with what to do. If he lost them now, he might never discover what they intended. But he could only follow for so long without being too obvious. Then, as if on cue, a black sedan pulled up. The older man opened the trunk, and the younger man hoisted the newly claimed duffel bag inside. The older man made a brief call on his phone, presumably verifying that this was indeed their ride. He stepped behind a pillar, debating his next move. Should he confront them? Approach them with some ruse? Perhaps pretend to be in the same rideshare line and eavesdrop further? At that moment, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Alarmed, he spun around, expecting a confrontation. Instead, he found one of the flight attendants, an older woman named Rosalind, who had been with the airline. For years, she stared at him, recognition dawning. "Sir," she said softly. "I thought that was you on the flight. Is everything all right?" He hesitated, scanning her face. Rosalind had been loyal and discreet for over a decade. She was aware of who he was but also understood the importance of keeping it confidential. "There may be a situation," he whispered. "Those two men over there, they were talking about something potentially dangerous. They might be targeting the airline or me personally." Her eyes widened, but she kept her composure. "I can alert airport security right now." He frowned. "I don't want them spooked. They're getting in that black sedan. If we can just get a license plate number and have security track them, that might be enough." Rosalind nodded. They both watched as the men closed the trunk and slid into the car. The older man looked over his shoulder, almost as if sensing their gaze. Quickly, the owner ducked behind Rosalind, feigning conversation. The younger man fiddled with something in the back seat, then the sedan peeled away, merging into the flow of traffic. As it passed, Rosalind stepped forward discreetly, snapping a photo with her phone. She exhaled, turning back to him. "Got the plate. I'll call it in." He nodded, relief flooding him. "Thank you. Let's hope we can figure out what their plan is." Rosalind placed a comforting hand on his arm. "I'll do whatever you need, sir." Then she moved away, phoning the details to the head of airport security. He remained where he was, heart pounding. He replayed the scenario in his head, from the men's cryptic conversation to their tense departure. He had no direct evidence of a crime, but their words strongly suggested something was amiss. He decided that once he got home, he would gather his personal security team, alert the local authorities, and possibly even do some digging into who those men were. The next day found him in an unremarkable office just outside the main hangar of the airline's regional headquarters. This small, nondescript room functioned as his personal base whenever he visited incognito. Only his most trusted staff knew about it. The walls were lined with photographs from the early days of the airline, including one of him shaking hands with a big investor who had helped fund the expansion. Across from him sat Myra, his head of corporate security. She was flipping through a set of photographs on a tablet, her expression grave. Rosalind had sent the plate number and a brief description of the two men. Myra was running an investigation. "These men, as far as we can tell, are associates of a group that calls itself the Equal Enforcement Initiative," she said, her voice carefully measured. "A small radical group that claims big businesses are exploiting minority communities. They stage protests, sometimes borderline criminal acts, to make their point. He set down his coffee. So do we think they're targeting me because of alleged exploitation, or do they actually plan to do something violent? Myra pursed her lips. Hard to say. They're known mostly for disruption rather than outright violence, but sometimes these groups escalate. The older man might be a suspect in a few break-ins at corporate offices around the city. If so, they could be planning sabotage, or maybe looking to publicly humiliate you. They might be trying to highlight a racial or social issue connected to your business. He sighed. I've always prided myself on inclusive practices. My philanthropic work focuses on education, job training, and bridging racial divides in underserved communities. If they'd only done their research, they'd see I'm not the enemy. Myra shrugged. Sometimes these groups just see you as a billionaire who must be complicit in the system. That's all they need to declare you a target. He nodded solemnly. We need to find them before they cause real damage. Did the plate number give us anything? Myra tapped the screen, revealing a record from the Department of Motor Vehicles. Cars a rental. Paid in cash using fake credentials. Dead end. We'll keep searching, though. He leaned back, feeling the weight of responsibility press on him. He was determined to stop them from hurting anyone or tarnishing the airline's reputation. Keep me posted. And let's beef up security around the corporate offices and maintenance hangars. I also want more discreet checks on the staff. They might try infiltration. Myra stood, her expression resolute. Consider it done. Over the following days, he found himself checking daily updates from Myra's team. Whenever a flight got delayed or there was a minor incident, his mind leapt to those men, wondering if they were behind it. He also spent late nights hunched over his desk, scanning data on the so-called Equal Enforcement Initiative. The deeper he dug, the more he realized their main focus was to call out racial inequities in the hiring and labor practices of large corporations. He always believed he'd done right by his workforce, but maybe there were cracks in the system that he hadn't noticed. If these men claimed they were sending a message, maybe it had to do with pointing out flaws in his company's track record. He felt a mix of defensive pride, he had tried to do good, and a nagging fear that maybe they'd found a genuine oversight. At the same time, life didn't slow down. A new route to expand the airline overseas was in the works, meaning endless meetings with potential international partners. Shareholders wanted reassurance that everything was on track. He juggled phone calls and emails, forever mindful of that underlying threat. One evening, as he prepared to leave the office, Myra burst in, eyes gleaming with urgency. We tracked them, she announced. They rented a small commercial property near the industrial district. Been there about 2 days. He sprang to his feet, adrenaline rushing. Are we calling the cops? Myra held up a hand. Already did. The local authorities are on it. Authorities want us to identify probable cause before they move in. They say the group has been known to occupy spaces but not necessarily break the law. We have to be careful. He paced across the room, heart pounding. So we need eyes on them. See what they're doing in there. I want to know if they're building bombs or printing pamphlets. Myra nodded. Exactly. I've got a guy on it, and he's discreet. But if there's any threat of danger, the authorities will swoop in. A tense day passed, then another. Myra's discreet agent kept watch on the property from an unmarked car, occasionally snapping photos. The older man and younger man came and went, sometimes hauling crates in or out. When questioned by a curious neighbor, the older man claimed they were setting up a community outreach center. On the third day, Myra arrived at the office with a new development. She placed a file on his desk. They've started distributing flyers, and the language is inflammatory. It accuses your airline of discriminatory hiring practices and claims you refuse to invest in minority-owned businesses, among other things. He scowled, scanning the flyers. They were a twisted version of his philanthropic record, painting him as a wolf in sheep's clothing. They cited outdated data that had since been corrected. They're basically trying to stir up trouble, make me look like a hypocrite. But so far, that's not illegal. Myra agreed. No, but the question is, are they planning more than just a smear campaign? That evening, he decided to pay a personal visit to the property. Myra cautioned him against it, saying it was risky, but he insisted on seeing for himself. They took an unmarked SUV, tinted windows concealing his presence. He parked on a side street, tension gripping him as he surveyed the dimly lit building. He saw a couple of young men stepping out, heading to a nearby convenience store. They wore hoodies and spoke quietly. He recognized the younger man from the plane, the bleached hair unmistakable in the glow of a street lamp. The older man didn't appear. He slipped lower in his seat. Let's wait and see if they come back with anything. Myra kept the engine running, scanning the area for police presence or suspicious activity. The industrial district was largely deserted at this hour, a stretch of road dotted with shuttered factories and warehouses. After a while, the young men returned with a couple of bags. They re-entered the building, and the door closed behind them. He checked his watch. I want to see if we can get a glimpse of what's inside. Myra shook her head, her voice firm. We don't have legal grounds for that yet. If we break in or peek through windows, it could compromise any future investigation. We have to do this properly. He gritted his teeth, frustration mounting. We can't just wait for them to strike. She softened. I understand, but if we act too aggressively without cause, we'll be the ones in trouble. Reluctantly, he nodded. Let's get out of here. I'll see if we can meet with a local community leader, someone who might open a dialogue. Maybe we can defuse this situation by talking. The following day, he reached out to a respected pastor known for mediating community disputes. The man agreed to meet him. He arrived at the pastor's modest church, located in a neighborhood long plagued by underinvestment. The pastor, a tall man with a gentle smile, welcomed him into his simple office. I'd been hearing chatter about a new group in town, the pastor said, offering him a seat. They're riling people up, claiming there's a big demonstration in the works. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I want to help address any legitimate concerns, but they're not approaching me directly. Instead, they're targeting my name, my airline, and suggesting we discriminate. That's not what I stand for. The pastor nodded sympathetically. I've heard both sides. Some folks in the community believe your airline's expansion didn't create enough jobs locally. Others believe you've done plenty of good through scholarships and outreach. The problem is, truth often gets lost in the shouting. A wave of despair washed over him. What if we hold a public forum? Provide data, show them the real numbers, and invite conversation. The pastor stroked his chin thoughtfully. That might help. But if these radicals are determined to smear you, they might not show up. Or they might show up just to grandstand. He exhaled slowly. I can't just sit by. They were on my airplane talking about sending a message. That suggests something bigger, something beyond flyers and rumors. I'll do what I can, the pastor promised. Let me see if I can reach out through some contacts. Maybe we can broker a meeting. As he left the church, he couldn't shake a sense of impending confrontation. He called Myra to share the new plan. She agreed to ramp up security around his upcoming public appearances, just in case. Days passed, and the tension only grew. The men continued their activities in that rented space, though Myra's team noted no sign of bomb-making or weapons stockpiling. They seemed to be painting large banners and contacting local activists. A few local radio stations received anonymous tips about a demonstration aimed at calling out the airline's racist practices. Finally, word trickled through that the group was planning a large-scale protest at the airline's corporate headquarters. The date circled on the calendar was ominously close. Myra prepped the security team, the building staff, and the local authorities. Still, no one knew if the demonstration would be peaceful or disruptive. That morning, he arrived at headquarters early. Police barricades were already set up. A few uniformed officers milled about, chatting with security personnel. The main entrance was roped off to create a buffer zone. Employees were advised to use side entrances. Around mid-morning, a crowd began to gather on the sidewalk. Some held signs with slogans like, "Stop the exploitation," and "Racial justice now." Others shouted into bullhorns, demanding accountability. He watched from an upper window, feeling a mix of anxiety and resolve. He spotted the older man leading a chant. The younger man handed out pamphlets. They weren't a massive crowd, maybe 30 or 40 people, but they were loud. Occasionally, passers-by slowed to see what the ruckus was about. Media vans pulled up, reporters aiming cameras at the protesters. The older man seized the spotlight, launching into accusations about how the airline refused to invest in minority neighborhoods and engaged in wage discrimination. He brandished a folder of evidence, likely the same papers he'd carried on the plane. Outrage churned in the owner's gut. He wanted to run downstairs and defend himself, but Myra cautioned restraint, reminding him that he could address the media in a controlled way. Eventually, he decided that letting rumors spread without a direct response could be equally damaging. He stepped outside into the cordoned-off area, accompanied by a couple of security guards. Cameras turned to him instantly. The older man's face registered momentary confusion. He probably hadn't expected him to show up in person. The younger man gaped, as if recognizing him from the plane but not quite believing it. Reporters surged forward, thrusting microphones in his direction. He raised a hand, signaling for calm. A hush spread through the crowd. "I understand there are concerns about my airline's business practices," he said firmly. "I'm here to listen and respond. We have data that refutes many of these claims, and we also have a record of community investment. If you have legitimate grievances, I want to hear them." The older man snorted. "We know who you really are, a profiteer who hides behind philanthropy. We've got the documents to prove it." He took a measured breath, doing his best to remain composed. "If you have credible evidence of wrongdoing, I'll address it. But I won't stand by while false accusations undermine the work we've done to empower communities." A reporter jumped in with a question. "Sir, do you deny that your company has refused to hire from certain neighborhoods based on race?" He looked the reporter in the eye. "Absolutely. We do not discriminate. In fact, we actively recruit from a diverse range of communities. We offer training programs and scholarships. I can give you specifics if needed." The older man scowled, flipping through his folder. "What about the employees who've complained about unequal pay?" He bristled internally. "Any employee complaint is taken seriously. We investigate and address issues promptly. If you know of specific cases, provide their names, and we'll investigate immediately." The tension was palpable. The demonstration had grown silent except for the hum of cameras recording every word. The crowd seemed unsure whether to continue shouting or to listen. Then, from the back of the group, a few additional protesters arrived carrying a large banner. They tried to push forward, but the police officers blocked them. The older man didn't flinch. He raised his voice, addressing the protesters. "This is the guy who pretends to care about equality while turning a blind eye to discrimination. We won't stop until we force him to face the truth." He took one step closer, adrenaline surging in his veins. "I'm right here, facing you now. Show me your evidence, and I'll either correct a real issue or prove that your claims are baseless." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the older man's face. Perhaps he hadn't expected direct confrontation. His eyes darted to the younger man, who looked torn between supporting the cause and doubting the validity of the older man's allegations. Reporters sensed the drama unfolding. The cameras zoomed in. Everyone waited. Finally, the older man rummaged in his folder, pulling out a sheath of papers. He thrust them toward the police line. "Go on, take a look at these," he sneered. One of the guards stepped forward, collected the papers, and handed them to the owner. He quickly scanned them. They included old financial statements, selective quotes from internal memos, and a few questionable testimonies from unnamed sources. At first glance, it looked like a patchwork of half-truths. He cleared his throat. "These documents are outdated. For instance, this memo references employee demographics from nearly a decade ago. We changed policies and increased diversity recruitment since then." The older man barked back. So you claim. People like you always have an excuse. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few protesters seemed unconvinced, others just glared at him. The younger man hung back, uncertainty etched on his face. Why not come inside? The owner offered. We can show you our current records on the condition that we maintain a civil discussion and that you stop spreading unverified accusations. The suggestion caused an uproar of competing voices. Some protesters demanded transparency. Others thought it was a trap. The older man looked offended by the invitation. You think I'm stupid? I'm not going into your den just so you can spin your corporate lies. We want justice in the public eye, where you can't hide. He felt frustration rising, but he reminded himself to keep calm. I'm not hiding. I'm out here talking to you. But if you want real answers, we need the facts, not just the spectacle. An awkward silence fell. Then one of the protesters, a young woman with tears in her eyes, stepped forward. My brother applied to your airline and never heard back. He was qualified. We believe it was because of his background. He turned to her gently. I don't know the specifics, but if you give me his name, I promise to personally follow up on his application. If there's any discrimination at play, I'll address it. If not, maybe there was another reason, like a background check issue or an incomplete application. The young woman wavered momentarily, caught off guard by his sincerity. She hesitated, then whispered her brother's name. He nodded. Thank you. I'll have someone contact you. Cameras recorded every moment. The older man, sensing the shift, tried to regain control. Don't be fooled by his promises. He's just trying to placate you. Before he could say anything further, the young woman turned to the older man. I want my brother to get a fair chance. Isn't that why we're here? The older man's expression hardened. Yes, but not by dancing to his tune. We need systemic change, not case-by-case handouts. She stood her ground. I'm not naive. But if he's serious, then maybe we can expose a real problem or find out there isn't one. The group started arguing among themselves. Some sided with the young woman, eager to see actual proof. Others yelled that it was all corporate spin. The older man tried to rally them back, but a fracture in the crowd's unity was evident. Sensing an opening, the owner addressed them. I'm willing to speak with representatives you choose, people you trust. Let's gather and go through every detail. I have no problem with scrutiny. But if you're just here to stage a spectacle,